Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen, and enjoy my stories every day. The silver hands of the clock on the mantelpiece inched past midnight, echoing in the silence that enveloped the room. Thomas sat in the dim glow of the table lamp, his fingers drumming on the wooden arm of the chair. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, heavy with foreboding. Clara, his wife, had not come home. It wasn't the first time, but tonight, anxiety gnawed at him more persistently. He tried calling her cell again, hearing the monotonous ring before it went to voicemail. "Clara, it's me again. Please, call me back when you get this," he said, his voice a mixture of worry and frustration. As dawn painted the sky with streaks of gray, Thomas made a decision. He couldn't sit idly by any longer. Pulling on his coat, he stepped out into the chilly morning air and drove to the local police station. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered as he approached the front desk where Officer Danvers sat, looking up from his paperwork with a raised eyebrow. "My wife, Clara, she hasn't come home. It's been over a day now, and this isn't like her," Thomas explained, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. Officer Danvers, a middle-aged man with a skeptical look, took down the details. "All right, Mr. Sinclair. We'll start looking into it. But you know, sometimes folks just need a bit of space." Thomas frowned, "Not Clara. Please, just find her." The week that followed was a blur of sleepless nights and relentless phone calls. Thomas's heart sank every time the phone rang, hoping for news, but dreading it all the same. Then, the call came. Officer Danvers's voice was grave. "Mr. Sinclair, we've found Clara." The words that followed seemed to come from far away, muffled and distorted. Clara was dead. They had found her body in a secluded area on the outskirts of town. She had been on her way to meet someone, her lover, according to the texts found on her phone. The revelation stung, an acute pain that seared through his chest. But the worst was yet to come. She was pregnant. The room spun around him as he struggled to process the information. Whose child was it? A single tear escaped Thomas's eye as he hung up the phone. His mind raced with betrayal and grief. The man Clara was meeting, the man responsible for all this, was his best friend, Michael. Consumed by a tumultuous mix of sorrow and rage, Thomas vowed to confront Michael. He needed answers, he needed to understand why. More than anything, he needed to look into the eyes of the man who had betrayed him in the cruelest ways imaginable. Driving to Michael's house, the streets seemed different, darker. When he arrived, he sat in the car for a long moment, gathering his resolve. Finally, he stepped out and walked up to the front door, his heart pounding in his chest. He rang the bell, and after a few moments that felt like an eternity, the door swung open. Michael stood there, confusion etching his face upon seeing Thomas. "Thomas, what are you? Did you know?" Thomas cut him off, his voice barely a whisper but laden with fury. "Did you know she was pregnant?" Michael's face paled, his eyes widening in shock. I had no idea." The air between them charged with tension, a storm about to break. Thomas stepped forward, his every muscle taut with the urge to unleash his anger. This was just the beginning. The path to the truth would be long and torturous, but Thomas was ready to walk it, no matter where it led. Thomas's stare was unyielding as he faced Michael in the doorway. The morning air was crisp, biting at his skin, but all he could feel was the heat of his anger. "Michael, I need to know everything," Thomas demanded, his voice firm, leaving no room for evasion. Michael stepped back, gesturing for Thomas to come in. "Let's talk inside," he muttered, a tremor in his voice betraying his calm facade. As Thomas entered, he noticed the disarray of the living room, cushions askew, coffee cups scattered across the table. It looked like Michael hadn't been sleeping much either. They sat opposite each other, the tension thick between them. Michael ran his fingers through his hair before he began, his voice low. "I loved her, Thomas. I never meant for any of this to happen. Thomas clenched his fists, feeling a wave of disgust. And the baby? Was it yours? I don't know. She never told me, Michael confessed, looking away, unable to meet Thomas's gaze. Before Thomas could reply, the doorbell rang. Frustration etched on his face, Thomas watched as Michael hesitated, then went to answer it. Standing at the door was Detective Laura Keene, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s known for her no-nonsense approach to her cases. "Mr. Sinclair, Mr. Gardner, may I come in?" she asked, her gaze flicking between the two men. Once inside, Detective Keene wasted no time. "We found something peculiar at the crime scene, a piece of a car headlight. It doesn't match the victim's car. We're checking all known vehicles connected to Mrs. Sinclair." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "You think someone followed her? Hit her?" "It's a possibility we're considering," Laura replied, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of deceit. The room fell silent for a moment, each man lost in his thoughts. Thomas broke the silence. "Detective, what else can we do to help?" "Well, I'd recommend you both think about anyone who might have held a grudge against Mrs. Sinclair or even you two. Sometimes the answers are closer than we think," she stated, handing Thomas her card. "Call me if anything comes to mind." After she left, Michael turned to Thomas, his face pale. "Thomas, I swear, I didn't follow her that night. I was here, alone." Thomas looked at him, a mix of pity and revulsion battling within. "I want to believe you, Michael, but right now, I can't trust anyone." As Thomas drove away from Michael's house, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He needed to know more. Deciding to take Detective Keene's advice, he made his way to Clara's best friend, Jessica, hoping she might shed some light on Clara's other relationships and the days leading up to her disappearance. Jessica lived in a quaint bungalow surrounded by a well-tended garden. The door opened to a warm smile, but her eyes clouded with sadness when she saw Thomas. "Thomas, I was so sorry to hear about Clara." "Please come in," she said, leading him into the living room. Once seated, Thomas wasted no time. "Jessica, did Clara mention anyone new at work or someone bothering her recently?" Jessica paused, her expression turning thoughtful. "There was someone. Eric. He seemed obsessed with her. Clara mentioned he was making her uncomfortable." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Do you know where I can find him?" "I think he works at the city library. Clara said he was often there, even on his days off," Jessica provided, worry etching her features. Thanking Jessica, Thomas left with a new lead. As he drove to the city library, his resolve hardened. He would find Eric. He would find out the truth, no matter how many stones he had to turn. The journey was just beginning, and every new discovery seemed to lead him deeper into a maze of secrets and lies. The city library loomed before Thomas as he parked his car across the street. Its large, arched windows gave it an air of solemnity, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within him. Steeling himself, he crossed the street and entered the quiet sanctuary of books and whispered secrets. Inside, he scanned the area, searching for any sign of the man Jessica had mentioned. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with spectacles perched on her nose, noticed his perplexed look and approached. "May I help you find something?" she asked, her voice a soft echo in the vast space. Thomas cleared his throat, keeping his tone even. "I'm looking for someone who might work here." "Eric. Does he happen to be around?" Her expression shifted slightly, a flicker of recognition passing over her face. "Eric is in the back, cataloging new shipments. I can take you to him if you'd like." "Thank you, that would be great," Thomas responded, following her through a maze of bookshelves toward the back of the library. They reached a secluded section where a man in his early 30s was sorting through a cart of books. He looked up, his eyes cautious yet curious. "Eric, this gentleman would like to speak with you," the librarian introduced. Thomas stepped forward, extending his hand, which Eric shook tentatively. "I'm Thomas Sinclair. I was wondering if we could talk about Clara Sinclair." Eric's face paled, his eyes widening slightly. I heard about what happened. I can't believe she's gone," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas observed him closely, noting the genuine shock and sorrow in his expression. "Did you know Clara well?" "We talked a few times when she came here." "She liked history books," Eric explained, shifting uncomfortably under Thomas's gaze. "Did you ever meet outside of the library?" Thomas pressed, watching for any sign of deception. No, we never did. I wanted to, but she wasn't interested," Eric admitted, his shoulders slumping. "Someone told me you might have made her uncomfortable. Is there any truth to that?" Thomas's voice was firm, demanding honesty. Eric hesitated, then sighed. "I might have been too friendly, too interested. I didn't mean to scare her. After she made it clear, I backed off. I swear." Thomas studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Okay. If there's anything you remember that might help, please let me know." He handed Eric a business card. "She was my wife, and I need to find out what happened to her." Leaving the library, Thomas felt a mix of frustration and clarity. Eric didn't seem capable of violence, just a lonely man who had stepped over the line. As he drove away, his phone rang. It was Detective Keene. "Mr. Sinclair, we've got a break in the case. Can you come down to the station?" Her voice was brisk, urgent. Within minutes, Thomas was speeding towards the police station, his mind racing. At the station, Detective Keene greeted him with a solemn nod. "We found some footage from a traffic camera near where your wife was found. It's not very clear, but you might be able to help us identify the car," she explained as they walked to her office. In her office, she played the grainy footage. A dark car appeared on the screen, slowing down near the area Clara's body was discovered. Thomas squinted, trying to make out the model. "It's hard to tell, but it looks like a sedan, maybe a Volvo," Thomas guessed, leaning closer to the screen. "We thought so too. We're running checks on all registered Volvos in the area. But there's something else." Keene paused, her expression serious. "We found traces of a drug in Clara's system. It's often used to incapacitate." A cold fury settled in Thomas's chest. "You think she was drugged, Anne?" "It's possible," Keene acknowledged. "We're doing everything we can to track down the owner of the car and anyone who might have had access to that drug." Thomas nodded, his resolve hardening. "Thank you, Detective. Please keep me updated." As he left the station, the weight of the unfolding truths pressed down on him. Someone had planned Clara's demise with chilling precision. And he wouldn't rest until he brought them to justice. Each piece of the puzzle added to the horrifying picture of a premeditated murder, and Thomas knew the road to uncovering the whole truth would be darker and more twisted than he had ever imagined. Thomas's world had narrowed to the quest for truth, each day feeding into the next with grim determination. After weeks of waiting and agonizing, a breakthrough finally came. Detective Keene called him early in the morning, her voice tense with urgency. "Thomas, we've identified the car. It was registered to a rental agency. And the last person to rent it was someone you know. Can you come to the station?" His heart pounding, Thomas drove to the station with a mix of dread and anticipation churning inside him. When he arrived, Keene ushered him into her office where the blinds were drawn, casting long shadows across the floor. "We traced the car to Michael Gardner," Keene revealed, her eyes watching Thomas closely for his reaction. Thomas felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. "Michael?" But his words faltered, the betrayal slicing through him anew. "Yes, he rented the car under a false name. We picked him up early this morning. He's waiting in the interview room now," she continued, her voice steady. Thomas followed her to the room, a storm of emotions raging within him. Behind the glass, Michael sat handcuffed, his head bowed. The door clicked open, and Thomas entered, his every nerve on edge. "Michael, why?" was all Thomas could manage, his voice hoarse with pain and anger. Michael lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed. "Thomas, I was obsessed with her. I thought if I couldn't have her, no one could. I didn't mean for her to die. It was an accident." The confession hit Thomas like a physical blow. "An accident? You drugged her, Michael. You planned this." "I just wanted to talk to her, to convince her to be with me. I never meant for her to get hurt," Michael pleaded, desperation coloring his tone. The room spun around Thomas as he absorbed the full weight of his friend's betrayal. "And the baby, Michael? Did you know about the baby?" Michael's gaze dropped to the floor. "I didn't know until it was too late." Detective Keene intervened then, her voice firm. "Mr. Gardner has been charged with manslaughter and unlawful imprisonment. We have enough evidence to go to trial." Thomas stared at Michael, his former friend, now nothing more than a stranger. "I trusted you, Michael. I treated you like a brother." Leaving the station, Thomas felt a hollow victory. Justice might be served, but it would not bring Clara back, nor would it mend the shattered pieces of his heart. As he walked out into the daylight, his phone rang. It was Jessica, Clara's friend. "Thomas, I'm so sorry to hear about everything. If there's anything I can do." "Actually, there is," Thomas cut in, a new resolve firming his voice. "I need to start fresh, away from here, away from the memories and the betrayals." "Of course, Thomas. Whatever you need," Jessica replied, her voice warm with sympathy. In the days that followed, Thomas sold the house, the place he and Clara had called home. Every room was a reminder of a life that would never be. He packed up his belongings, leaving behind anything that reminded him of Clara and Michael. Before he left town, he visited Clara's grave one last time. The headstone was simple, a stark reminder of how quickly life could turn. He laid flowers, his thoughts a tangled mess of sorrow and relief. "Goodbye, Clara. I wish things could have been different," he whispered. Driving away from the cemetery, Thomas didn't look back. The road ahead was uncertain and likely lonely, but he was ready to face it, to build something new from the ruins of his past. The town, with all its ghosts and shadows, faded into the distance behind him, a chapter firmly closed. As the miles stretched out before him, he realized the hardest part wasn't just finding the truth, it was learning to live with it.